Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be asked here tonight by the Aurora History Museum to present and to talk to you a little bit about my experiences growing up as a gamer. I'd also like to thank you for being here and supporting this institution. I admit, before I was invited to speak, I didn't know there was an Aurora History Museum. But it's a fantastic institution to have in a city like Aurora, and it's great to have people support it. So when I was asked to speak, I was told the topic was about growing up as a gamer, and that brought a whole lot of things to my mind. As somebody who grew up in the early days of video games, but I also thought of something else, which is my kids, who themselves are growing up as gamers. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is how my generation of gamer is different from my kids' generation, how the gaming landscape is different between them. And I'm going to talk about just a handful of games, really, that hopefully illustrate that difference. And also along the way, maybe you'll learn a little bit about how games are developed and game design. First, since we're at a history museum, a quick history lesson. You can get a much better history lesson down the hall. But in the late 50s, early 60s is really when the first video games, original video games, were created for computer systems. This game here that they're playing in this image is called Space War. And it involves using these little switches they had to move spaceships around on the screen there and try to shoot each other with missiles. So before this point, you maybe had computers running chess programs or tic-tac-toe and derivative games that already existed. But something like Space War is generally considered pretty close to the first original video game. By the early 70s, you had a little bit of these video games coming into the mainstream consciousness, with systems like Pong showing up in bars and restaurants being enormously successful. And not too long afterwards, you had home video game systems like the Atari, which was made by the people who made Pong. By the early 80s, you had kids like me packing into arcades and playing who knows what from a library of hundreds of games that were available to be played, and the industry was booming. So I was one of those kids. I probably wore those really short shorts, just like that. I don't know why anyone let us do that. But what I want to point out is, these guys, the very first game developers, that's pretty momentous. But just as momentous is these kids over here are the first kids who are growing up pretty much their whole lives with a brand new medium of video games. So what can we say about this first generation of gamers? Well, they're growing up in terms of games in a very dynamic environment. The technology has just barely started. It's building into finding new ways, new systems are coming out all the time, new genres of games are being invented, and these first gamers are devouring this stuff as soon as it's coming out. They're very curious and energized by the newness of all this stuff that's around them. And there's really been nothing like these games before. At the same time, some people around them find games to be a little bit weird, kind of pointless. I sort of think of this first gamer generation like WALL-E. You've seen the movie WALL-E. He's sort of cobbled together from whatever parts were available at the time. Kind of like these gamers, their gaming experience is put together by the pieces. Stuff that's just being developed right at that very moment. But he finds wonder around every corner. And some people might look at him and think he's kind of a little sad or a little lost, falling around in his junkyard. But Generation 2 is different. Generation 2 has grown up with games as a fully developed media industry. It's huge. It's bigger than movies now in terms of gross profit. These kids are immersed in games pretty much everywhere they go and everywhere they look. There's all kinds of systems available now, and including mobile devices, right? Handheld, they can take games anywhere they want. And really, games aren't new or exotic or weird to hardly anybody anymore. We've learned that they're part of the media landscape for us. So that's generation 2, and we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about how they're similar or different from the first gamer generation. But I want to point out, well, who's making the games that generation 2 is playing right now? Well, it's this kid who was playing Hubert in the arcades. Now he's grown up and he's a game developer. It's me. Now, like any artist, if I may, game developers have influences. They take games that they remember playing and enjoying, and they try to push the limits, push the boundaries, experiment with them, and see what else they can make from some of these same ideas. So, what might a game developer from this generation think of? Well, he might think about Hubert, which he played in arcades. But there might be other places that he ran across games, even in school. He might think about this game. Anyone recognize that game? Oregon Trail. Now, a lot of people have played this game. In fact, a lot of non-gamers are familiar with this game from their time in school. Oregon Trail, there was earlier versions, I think came out earlier in the 70s, but the Apple II version really, I think, is the one most people remember, and I believe it's from 1985. It's a game about life and death as a pioneer. It's really an extraordinary game, and from a game design perspective, it's a fantastic game. A lot of educational games kind of get a bad rap. People think, they're not great games because they're trying too hard to teach you something. Oregon Trail is a fantastic example, I think, of both. When it comes to influences, I've sort of picked this as an example because just in the last few years, you've started to see game developers draw on, very clearly, as you'll see, on Oregon Trail, their memories of Oregon Trail. For example, in 2010, someone made a game called So Long, Oregon, Let's Go Find El Dorado, which involves taking your little Conestoga wagon and jumping it off of mountains, and flipping it around in circles in the air, driving through Indian villages and picking up smallpox. The gameplay ultimately is not really fundamentally like Oregon Trail, but you see it tracks your food and the health of the people on your little trip, and it's obviously meant to be a little bit silly. There's also Super Amazing Wagon Adventure, came out just recently. As you might be able to tell, it's sort of a frantic shooter, but again, it has elements like tracking your different people in your party. You still ford rivers. You also can jump over them. If I recall correctly, fly into space. In the process, it's pretty silly. And then there's a game like Oregon Trail, which is your station wagon west to escape the zombie apocalypse. So now these are examples of what we today call indie games. You're not necessarily going to see like direct examples of Oregon Trail coming out of a major publisher, but actually a lot of guys who make these indie games, they're game developers for bigger companies, and they do the indie work on the side. But clearly, they remember their games from their childhood, and it affects them. So let me maybe take the personal angle here. In 1983, the Apple IIe came out. I got one of these probably 1984 or 1985. My dad brought one home to me. For our family. He was convinced computers were a big thing. He was not a very technical person, but the Apple IIe had 64K of RAM. Things in perspective, modern computers have 125,000 times more memory than this computer did. I was extremely excited when I upgraded this to 128 kilobytes of RAM. I could play a whole bunch of games I couldn't play before. It also had monochrome graphics. That means one color. It was green. And we loved it. Not too long after I got the Apple II, a friend of the family, a little bit older than me, he was fairly computer savvy at the time, came by and brought a disc. Of course, one of those big 5.25-inch floppy disks that had a game on it. And this was the first game. It wasn't the first game I played, it was the first game I owned. and played over and over and over. It's a game called Karateka. Came out in 1984, and here's what it looked like in glorious monochrome. Now, if I were to try to describe the game to you, the first thing I might do is tell you a little bit about what happens. In Karateka, you try to rescue the princess from the warlord's fortress by defeating all his minions with your awesome karate. Actually, a lot of people might describe a game this way, but it's not a very good way to describe a game. So, if I really want to explain what Karateka is like, well, maybe actually, this might work well for describing a movie or a novel, but let's try some pictures. Here's what it looked like in color. Eventually, I got a color monitor for my Apple IIe, and got to enjoy 4 colors. So a picture's worth 1,000 words. Does this tell you anything more about what the game is like? Well, maybe, okay, you're kicking guys, hurting them. There's these triangles down here. I'm not real sure what those are about. While I'm on the subject of how it looks, though, I mean, this is actually a very beautiful game.
Oh, yeah.
And if you ever get a chance, you might be able to find some online to see this game in motion. It has amazing, very smooth animations on these karate moves. It's really pretty innovative. And this is some beautiful art, I think, considering you have 4 colors and these huge pixels. But again, I don't think the pictures do a very good job of describing the game. So I want to talk about Karateka the way the game designers talk about the game. And one way we do is with this concept of game loops. So a game loop is an activity in a game that you do over and over and over. And every time you do something, the computer responds with some kind of feedback. So the player acts and the game reacts. But the key about game loops is that every game loop is made up out of smaller game loops that take less time and are smaller scale decisions. So let me describe Karateka as a game loop. Well, at the top level, the loop of Karateka is playing the game from start to finish. It may not seem like a loop, it may seem like it starts somewhere and then it ends somewhere, but actually, because it only took 20 minutes to win Karateka, and most likely you were going to die a few minutes in anyway and try again, you ended up playing this game over and over again, even if you were pretty good at it. You'd watch the lovely intro, you'd fight a whole bunch of guys, you'd rescue the princess, and you'd get your little finale at the end. Now the smaller loops inside that big loop are mainly 16 combat encounters that you have with these different minions of the warlord, one-on-one battles. And so when we analyze that next level of the game loop, you say, well, this loop is to engage with one of these enemies and either defeat him or be defeated. You do this by attacking him and trying to take down his hit points before he takes down yours. These little triangles, when one of them goes to 0, these ones go to 0, you're done. When his go to 0, he's defeated, and you move on and fight the next game. Well, that game loop has a smaller game loop inside that. And these are the second decisions that you're making about what kind of attacks you want to make, or do you want to go on the defensive. And in Karateka, you only had a very limited vocabulary of actions. You could punch and kick, and you could do either of those high, try to kick the guy in the face, punch low, or in the middle, and you could move left and right. That was basically the entire vocabulary of what you had to do, what you were able to do in Karateka. So the whole game is built up out of these very minute, quick, reflexive decisions you have to make about which of these keys you have to push. And from that, then you build the entire game. It's just a series of making decisions. What button I want to push when. So hopefully that describes a little more what it's like to play Karateka than just when I tell you use your awesome karate to beat some bad guys. Karateka spawned, along with a couple other games, spawned a whole genre that's still very fruitful today, of fighting games. And they basically built on what Karateka did, and added more and more complexity, more graphical detail to what was going on. For example, Street Fighter added a whole series of complex maneuvers. Now instead of just, oh, I hit Q to punch up, now it's I push down, left, up and to the left, right, push this button, that button, in order to do some particular move, and you have a huge set of moves that you can do. Later, fairly infamously, Mortal Kombat added the idea of extremely over-the-top, kind of stupidly brutal finishing moves. These are really rewards for beating the other guy. They're kind of a stimulating reward for you. And then Virtua Fighter brought the games into a 3D space with 3D characters. Well, I want to go a little bit further than that and talk about a game that in some ways comes from this line of fighting games, but is also in a way very, very different. It's a game called Shadow of the Colossus. This came out for the PlayStation 2, I think in 2005. And in Shadow of the Colossus, you're this guy down here, you can see him, and you're fighting that guy. And a whole series of them. In fact, interestingly, you're fighting 16 Colossus in Shadow of the Colossus, the same number as Karateka. One-on-one battles, just like Karateka. So at the top level, Shadow of the Colossus, in terms of the game loops, looks identical to Karateka. But obviously, trying to do a high kick on this guy is not going to do anything, right? So when you get down closer, it's a very different game. And to explain that level, I'm going to jump back again now to another important game on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Came out in 1985, and its primary system-selling game, most famous game, does anyone know? Super Mario Brothers. Super Mario Brothers is an example of what we call a platformer. It's called a platformer because, well, mainly what you do in the game is jumping. You jump onto these platforms and try to get to get around. Now, Super Mario Brothers and Karateka, in a lot of ways, are very different types of games. In a fighting game like Karateka, the focus is on the enemies. You're running up against these characters, you're trying to beat them before they beat you. And what makes it challenging is the behaviors of those enemies. Some of them attack faster, or some of them slower. Some of them are more aggressive, or less aggressive. And you're trying to learn how are they behaving so that I can counter whatever they're doing. And the method you have to counter them is use your own attacks. Super Mario is very different. Platformers are very different. The focus on the platformer is on the environment, the space that you're in. If you notice in Karateka, the environment is true for the whole game is flat. You're just on a flat one. In Super Mario Bros., you're jumping between all these platforms. The challenges are obstacles. Now there are creatures, there are enemies in a sense, in Super Mario Brothers, but they move very, very predictably. And really they become timing puzzles. Trying to learn when can I land on this guy, jump on top of him, or avoid him. In a way, they're much less complex than the behaviors in Karateka. And your method of winning the game is navigation, jumping, running, and moving through the environment, falling down a pit, or running into it. Let's go back to Shadow of the Colossus. Because in Shadow of the Colossus, you've now combined these. At the high level, it's a fighting game. You're encountering one of these giant creatures, and you're trying to defeat it. And the first thing you do, as in Karateka, is you try to learn what's the Colossus' behavior. Maybe if I shoot him in the leg with an arrow, he's going to bend over like this, and now I can jump onto him and grab on to some hairy spot in his arm where I can hold on. Because what I end up doing is navigating the Colossus. Really, he's not an enemy or an environment, he's both. He's an enemy and an environment wrapped up together, because now I have to climb on him to jump to some spot, some weak spot, where I can hurt him. Maybe it's the top of his head or the middle of his back. And so I'm climbing along him and he's trying to shake me off. The point of bringing up Shadow of the Colossus really is to say, this is a game that my kids' generation of gamer, they're playing, and they don't realize that for me, when I was growing up, you couldn't make a game like this. The technology really didn't allow it. And the vocabulary and genres hadn't evolved to the point where we could really comprehend of this kind of gameplay. here's another game that really stands out as a unique and sort of experience that we didn't have when I was growing up. It's a game called Minecraft. I guess as a lot of people have probably heard of it. It's extremely popular. It's also a very strange game. It's probably the most important game of the last 5 years. But Minecraft is unique because this game sold 1 million copies before it was even finished. The person who built it started selling it before it was even done. It's now made millions and millions of dollars. It's now on multiple platforms. It's got unique sandbox gameplay. And by sandbox, we mean the world's kind of open to you. We're not giving a specific goal. We're not saying rescue the princess, like we were in Karate and in Super Mario Bros. We're saying, do whatever you want. Dig some of this dirt over here, knock down a tree, start building some stuff. You fight zombies in here, sure, but a lot of it's about building, farming, animal husbandry. You can raise creatures in this game. You can do dimensional travel. It's full of all kinds of things to do, and there's nothing in particular pointing you a particular way. Again, my 4-year-old plays Minecraft. This is the sort of game they all take for granted at this point. It goes beyond the boundaries of what we really conceived of. But I think it's important to point out that, well, it's not a game like maybe in a way we would have thought of when I was younger, but all of these are games. And I want to analyze this idea of what a game is real quickly and go just a little bit deeper into our game loops. So I said that in a game loop, the player acts and the game reacts. But that really starts at a point with the player making a decision. You couldn't have games without decisions. It's what makes them interactive. And a very smart man, game designer by the name of Sid Meier, defines the game this way. He says the game is a series of interesting decisions. That's what defines a game. As you continue along this loop, well, you get to the point where the game starts to give you feedback, and a lot of times it takes the form of a reward. If you did the right thing, you're going to get a reward. If you failed, no, you didn't get a reward. Well, what that means when you're coming back around this game loop is you're thinking, did I make the right decision to get that reward? Or maybe I made the right decision and I didn't have the skill to pull it off to get that reward. But either way, what actually happens is learning. And another pretty smart guy by the name of Ralph Koster says fun is just another word for learning. Fun's the point of the game. Games, he says, are learning engines. Now, a lot of what the game is teaching me is something that really is only useful in the game. Learning to jump well as Mario, okay, probably doesn't have a lot of applications outside of me sitting in front of my television. But this is about learning. Now, it's important to talk about how decisions in games are different from decisions in real life. In a game, the decisions you can make are very clear. In Minecraft, I have all those blocks, and there's a lot of them. But if I want to dig, I know I've got to break these discrete blocks. The rules are consistent. In Minecraft, when I combine 2 pieces of wood and some stone, I'm going to get a stone axe that lets me cut down trees faster. I have a limited action set. Think of Karate, where I had a few buttons I could push, and that's it. And the game will reward me consistently when I do good things. It will reward me more for the things that are harder to do. And when I fail, it's not so bad. Mario respawns. Right? Well, in real life, it's not like that, is it? Decisions in real life are nuanced and complex. The rules are inconsistent. I don't always know that I'm going to get rewarded for doing the right thing. And if I fail, well, in some cases, that could change my life. No wonder we love to play games. So how does this apply to Generation 2? Because as a game developer, when people find out I'm a game developer, I always get this question. Sometimes not even really a question, but people come up and say, you know, my kid loves video games, or my grandkid loves video games. And there's this sort of implicit question of, is that okay? Is this good or bad for him? And of course, we always want to define things as good or bad, but it's never quite so simple. But here's what I would say. There's a good side in that games can be, in a sense, practice for real-life decision-making. A place to experiment where it is safe to try different things and learn how to make good decisions. On the flip side, games can be a place, if you spend too much time just making decisions in games, you may never become comfortable making decisions in real life. You retreat to that safe place, and you don't know how to make decisions in real life. So, as Generation 1 gamer, my advice to a Generation 2 gamer is look for ways to apply what you do in games to real life. Find a bridge between the two. Obviously, don't forget the real life is out there, and also remember that the rewards for the things you do in real life, well, they're real. So they're a little bit better than the rewards you're going to get in the game. And that's it. Do we have time for questions?
We unfortunately do not have time for questions because we have a movie date over at the Aurora Public Library. But let's give a round of applause for this very educational and informational